At the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union entered into a time of geopolitical tension that was referred to by later generations as the Cold War. At this time, both world powers were preparing, with the help of their various allies, offensive-defensive strategies in the event of an attack by the other. The level of trust between the United States and the Soviet Union was at an all-time low, while tensions were at an all-time high. This all led to the events that occurred in October of 1962. Americans now referred to these events as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets as the Caribbean Crisis, and Cuba as the October Crisis. Regardless, it became 13 of the most threatening days of the era. After the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs by troops sanctioned by the United States, and because the United States developed the capability of striking Russia by placing armed nuclear Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, the Soviet Union felt the need to respond to the perceived increased threat. The Soviet Union then sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, both to help them in case of an invasion by the United States, and also to level the playing field by bringing nuclear weapons into close proximity of the United States. October 16, 1962, Day 1. President John F. Kennedy was briefed by national defense officials and foreign policy advisors on surveillance photos that had been taken 2 days prior. The photos were of a Soviet missile base being constructed in Cuba near San Cristobal, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Because of this information, the president was faced with the decision on whether to order an airstrike and invasion of Cuba to eliminate the threat, or to use a military blockade to quarantine Cuba to prevent the completion of the missiles. On this day, the president didn't make a decision, but kept to his normal schedule so that he did not raise any suspicion to the rest of the world that anything was out of the ordinary. October 17, 1962, Day 2. President John F. Kennedy continued with his regular duties as president while gathering additional detailed information on the developing crisis. More surveillance photos were brought in, and the United States military forces were moved to bases in the southeastern part of the nation in preparation for any potential response to the growing threat in Cuba. October 18, 1962, Day 3. President Kennedy, along with his secretary, U.S. Ambassador Thompson, Mr. Hillenbrand, and Mr. Akalovsky, met with representatives of the Soviet Union in the meeting where the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, Mr. Semenov, Soviet Ambassador Dromyan, and Mr. Sukharev. In the meeting, both sides seemed to dance around threatening statements to each other, while leaving enough room to, if being called upon, could claim cultural misunderstanding. The representatives of the United States told the Soviet Union that they were uncomfortable with the Soviets supplying Cuba with arms, and that they viewed that as a direct threat to the United States. The Soviet Union delegation explained that the arms that they were supplying to the Cubans were just for defensive purposes and that the United States had absolutely nothing to worry about. The Soviets then pointed out that the Cubans also felt uneasy at the result of 150,000 reservists that the United States had mobilized along the southeastern border. October 19, 1962, Day 4. Nothing was done by the United States. President Kennedy kept to his regular schedule, while his advisors debated over the various plans of action. October 20th, 1962, Day 5. President Kennedy and his advisors met to discuss what would be the best way to handle the Cuban situation. After 5 hours of discussion, they concluded that a naval quarantine would be the best way to handle the growing threat. After this, plans were put into place for the naval quarantine. President Kennedy began to write his speech designed to notify the people of the United States about the growing situation in Cuba. They also discussed, but did not reach a decision, on an airstrike that would potentially destroy the missiles. October 21st, 1962, Day 6. President Kennedy has another council meeting and then met with General Walter Sweeney of the Tactical Air Command. General Sweeney informs the president that an airstrike could not absolutely guarantee the destruction of all missiles inside of Cuba. On October 22nd, 1962, Day 7. President Kennedy calls former Presidents Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, as well as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and informs them of the developing situation with Cuba and the Soviets. Here, we have the actual conversation with Kennedy and Eisenhower.
I got the leadership coming back at 5 this afternoon. Then we begin this blockade. Then we will continue the surveillance. I would anticipate two or three things. First, that Khrushchev will make a statement that any attack upon Cuba will be the same as he made at the time of the Suez business, will be regarded as an attack upon the Soviet Union, be responded to by all the weapons at their command. Number one. Number two is we have to assume that as this surveillance continues with the U-2s, that these SAM sites may shoot one down.
President Kennedy then writes a letter to Nikita Khrushchev informing him that the United States is determined to stop the missile bases from being completed and to remove them from Cuba. President Kennedy also informed Mr. Khrushchev that the United States has, to this point, limited their military action in order to facilitate continued peaceful negotiations. Secretary of State Dean Rusk formally notified Soviet Ambassador Antonio Drobyan that President Kennedy will make a speech to the nation notifying them of the developing conflict. At 7 p.m., President Kennedy went on live television to the nation of the situation and announces the naval quarantine. October 23, 1962, Day 8. U.S. naval ships move into position surrounding Cuba. President Kennedy pulls the ships back 500 miles from the original lines drawn to give Khrushchev time to consider the quarantine. President Kennedy writes Khrushchev another letter asking him to halt all tankers carrying weapons going into Cuba so that the United States would not have to stop them by force. October 24, 1962, Day 9. Nikita Khrushchev writes to President Kennedy a letter describing how unwise it is for the United States to give the USSR an ultimatum when they are talking about negotiations of peace. Khrushchev wrote, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying, and you want to persuade me to agree to this? What would it mean to agree to these demands? It would mean guiding oneself in one's relations with other countries not by reason, but by submitting to arbitrariness. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us." Khrushchev's response only adds to the rising tensions between the two countries. All Russian vessels halt, slow down, or reverse their course except for one tanker named the Bucharest. The U.S. Joint Chiefs and Staff order the military to go to DEFCON 2, the highest DEFCON the nation has ever been in while not in a war. October 25, 1962, Day 10. The aircraft carrier USS Essex and the destroyer USS Gearing attempted to intercept the Russian tanker Bucharest. Tensions continued to escalate when the Bucharest's captain did not comply with the orders to stop and reverse course given by the Essex and Gearing. Fortunately, the Navy exercised restraint and did not fire upon the Bucharest, allowing her to continue on to Cuba. The U.S. Navy determined that the Bucharest was carrying petroleum and not material for the missile construction. October 26, 1962, Day 11. President Kennedy finds out that some missiles are operational and that there has not been a halt in the construction of the missile bases. The President and his advisors debate whether or not the United States should invade Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev writes a letter to Fidel Castro explaining to him that if the United States were to invade Cuba, Castro should fire the missiles that are operational at the United States. Nikita Khrushchev also writes a letter to President Kennedy explaining that the Soviets will remove the missiles in exchange for lifting the naval quarantine, and a pledge that the U.S. will not invade Cuba. On October 27, 1962, Day 12. Tensions continue to escalate as the United States U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba while on a photo reconnaissance mission. Despite the aggressive action, the United States resists the urge to retaliate against Cuba or the Soviet Union, in hopes that a peaceful agreement can still be reached. Khrushchev then publicly speaks that Russia will remove missiles from Cuba if the United States lifts the quarantine on Cuba and removes their missiles from Turkey. Later that night, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy meets secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobryan. The two men reach a basic understanding that the Soviet Union will withdraw missiles from Cuba under United Nations supervision in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. In addition, the United States agrees to eventually remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey. On October 28, 1962, Day 13, the USSR accepts the United States terms and withdrew its missiles from Cuba. The United States then lifted the naval quarantine on Cuba, thus ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the end of the year, the United States removed its missiles from Turkey in secret. This crisis shows great valor in the face of nuclear war, showing that the world's conflicts can be solved with peaceful negotiations and compromise.